Now you're looking. thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It's always good in a somber situation to be together in community. So
Here.
thank you that we're all here, and we're really, really honored to have this duo here tonight to discuss all things legal, as we need to venture forth. But we're really honored to have Kim Wehle here to honor her new book, Pardon Power. And Kim is a constitutional scholar and tenured professor of law at University of Baltimore School of Law. And she was formerly an assistant U.S. attorney and associate counsel in the Whitewater investigation. And Professor Wehle is also a legal expert for ABC News, a contributor for BBC World News, and a regular guest on NPR's Morning Edition. She also writes for The Atlantic, Politico, The Hill, and The Bulwark. And she's the author of How to Read the Constitution and Why, and she lives in Chevy Chase, Maryland, with her children. And she's recently the 2024-25 recipient of the Fulbright U.S. Scholar Award. And we're really honored to have Jessica Henry back at Watchung Booksellers to lead the discussion this evening. Jessica is an author, professor, legal commentator, blogger, and social justice advocate. After obtaining her JD from NYU School of Law, she served as a public defender in New York City for nearly a decade. And Professor Henry has written numerous articles for academic and mainstream publications. Her research interests include wrongful convictions, severe sentences, including death penalty and life without parole, and hate crimes. She frequently appears as a commentator on national and local television and radio, and has been widely cited in the mainstream media. In 2020, she published Smoke But No Fire, Convicting the Innocent of Crimes That Never Happened. So thank you. You're also the creator and host of the podcast, Just Justice. So thank you both for being here tonight.
Thank you all so much for coming out. As Margot said, it is nice to be in community, even if some of us are not feeling like it. It's a tough evening. But I am really excited to be having this conversation tonight because it is so relevant and so important to what's happening in our world, in our country, for the state of our future democracy. And we have the expert here to help us unpack it all. And so this book, which is a wonderful book, I spent the entire weekend reading it and it just flew by. It's a great read. I'd highly recommend it. Your title refers to the president's power to pardon. And I thought we could just start there at the federal level. Like, what is the power to pardon?
The power to pardon is to forgive federal crimes. It's grounded in this concept of mercy that goes back to the Code of Hammurabi. Famously, in the New Testament, Jesus Christ of Nazareth was denied a pardon in favor of a murderer by the name of Barabbas. Pontius Pilate gave it to the Romans to make that decision. That was traditional within the Jewish tradition at the time. And of course, the Christian religion flowed from that particular denial of pardon. So the framers of the Constitution borrowed it from common law England. And the idea is that, in theory, the criminal justice system gets things wrong, and someone in the room needs to step in and correct injustices. And so a federal pardon is in Article 2 of the Constitution. The president can grant pardons and reprieves except in the case of impeachment. And the idea is it basically forgives all the work of the other two branches, or it wipes them out, right? So Congress passes laws and decides there's a crime if you do certain things. You'll go through the criminal justice system, you're indicted, or there's an information, guilty plea or a conviction, jury conviction, there's appeals. The pardon is really putting the president, in this instance, above the other two branches, and there are very little checks on it. It can be subjective for whatever reason, hard to get one, but that's a traditional idea that exists, I think, in every country in the world except for China.
Yeah, so it's not uniquely American, it's not a modern phenomenon, but what you do so well here, in addition to taking us all the way back, so if you're a history buff, it's really a fun read. You sort of trace what our founding fathers were struggling with, right? Because it did make its way into Article 2 of the Constitution. That's a really big deal, right? The articles are the first things our founders wrote. But there were some real concerns that you document. Can you tell us a little bit about what our founding fathers were worried about? Some of them, anyway.
Yeah, so there was a debate in England when the king had this pardon power between the king and Parliament. There were lots of history around that, where the Parliament wanted to check and restrain the king's pardon power. And actually, surprisingly, King George III had more restraints on his power to pardon than the Supreme Court of the United States believes, and has established recently, that the president has. The Enlightenment thinkers were debated the need for a pardon and whether there should be a pardon, because in theory, and you probably know more about this than I do, if there's believed to be this magic wand that could come in and fix injustices, there's less incentive to make sure there aren't injustices in the process itself. There's less incentive to make sure the system is fair, and that you fix the jury process, the rules, etc. So the framers didn't talk about it a whole lot. There was some discussion, though, about an overbearing president abusing it. So there were suggestions to have the United States Senate have to weigh in on pardons, and that is the case in other parts of the world, that there's a legislative check on pardons. There was also a recommendation to ban pardons for treason. But ultimately, I think it was Hamilton and Madison that said, no, we need to have this ability for the president to do this. And I think there was, think about it back then, only white males with money could vote. It was a very small country. And these folks all knew each other, and they sort of passed the jobs around. Supreme Court justice one day, president the next day, right? And so I think there was this understanding, this expectation that there just wouldn't be an abuse. And there was a very deep concern at the time about Congress being the branch that had too much power and would abuse power. And so I think there was a thought that the president was necessary to tamp down the excesses of populism and even representative democracy in the other major branch, Congress.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that was so interesting when I was reading this was just to realize that there was this foreshadowing of potential for abuse, which we're going to get to just sort of when we're talking about the scopes and the checks on pardon powers. But it was really I just didn't realize that they had that big discussion about it. Can you tell us a little bit, you talked about pardon, and I know in your book you use pardon very broadly, but can you just tell us what types of pardons or clemency there is?
Yeah, so clemency is the big sort of other umbrella term, but the two main kinds are a pardon, which I said is forgiveness. It doesn't wipe out all the implications of your crime, but it basically means the crime and the conviction's gone. And then there's commutation, which is you still have the crime, but we'll lower the sentence. So it could go from, a death penalty to life in prison, or a long imprisonment sentence to something shorter. But the two major categories I talk about are individual pardons. So someone applies, you're forgiven, and then what is known as amnesty, which is mass pardons. And this is something that also happens around the globe. In some parts of the world, there were amnesty pardons for people imprisoned during the COVID pandemic, that we don't want, mass deaths and illnesses. Sometimes there's amnesty pardons or mass pardons if there's overcrowding in prisons in other parts of the world. Or there can be pardons on certain days to sort of show the largesse of the person in charge. So the very first pardon in American history was by George Washington. It was an amnesty pardon for people who participated in the Whiskey Rebellion, which Hamilton was the first Treasury Secretary, and imposed a tax on distillers of whiskey because he thought it was, kind of irreverent and excessive, and that's an easy place to tax people because you shouldn't be drinking. And there was protests, and there was some violence, and George Washington pardoned the whiskey rebels. So the idea behind amnesty pardons is to sort of move the country through some kind of trauma. Abraham Lincoln and Johnson both pardoned people who participated in the rebellion that were Confederate soldiers. Abraham Lincoln actually really liked pardons for other reasons. I ran into Doris Kearns Goodwin, you might have heard of her. I ran into her in the CNN green room, and she's written a lot about Lincoln, and I didn't know this when I wrote the book, but she said he was so distressed during the war about the loss of life. He would get requests from wives and mothers for pardons for transgressions of the Union soldier rules, right? So if you fell asleep on watch, there could be very severe penalties. And so he used the pardon a lot during the war to pardon Confederate soldiers, knowing that there was so much tragedy. So it made him feel better, she said. But also after the war, pardon Confederates on the idea that we need to, unify the country. And then fast forward to Vietnam, Jimmy Carter pardoned people that were dodged the Vietnam draft. And so that's the other category. There's no distinction in the Constitution, but I argue in the book that in a way is almost more palatable because there's political pushback, right? So some people think, Carter, one of the reasons he didn't get a second term was because that was such a controversial decision. Likewise, I don't know if there's an amnesty pardon, but we can talk about it. Ford's pardon of Nixon also, many think, lost him a second term, which was designed also, it was a single pardon, but ostensibly designed to move the country forward after Watergate. Although if you read the book, John Dean, who was White House counsel during the Nixon administration, famously told Congress there's a cancer on the White House, ended up actually convicted of crime, losing his bar license. I did a panel with him, he did the Ford, but I did a panel with him at the University of Michigan, the 50-year anniversary of the Ford pardon and Ford's presidency, and he said, actually, that's not true. That's not why he pardoned Nixon. The reason he pardoned Nixon is he didn't want his presidency to be mired in the constant process that would be required to actually bring him to trial, that he himself would have to testify, would have to be producing documents. He just wanted to deal with it. So actually, at least that's one insider's view. It wasn't really about amnesty and moving the country along. It was about Ford being able to be president and not having to deal with the headache because they were going to indict him. They had it all ready to go.
That's fascinating. And when you talk about amnesty also, right, so there's that healing idea, but then isn't there also a symbolic component to that as well? So when we look at some of the pardons that some of our modern day presidents have issued, even Biden recently with his 1,000 pardons or whatever it was for marijuana offenders, which really didn't help too many people in practice. But right, that was a symbolic.
Well, then there's posthumous pardons.
Right.
So pardons of people that were convicted, during Jim Crow, egregious, convictions based on race. There are posthumous pardons to send a message of healing and mercy and a request for forgiveness, that kind of thing. It doesn't actually satisfy the theory behind pardons historically, which is to help a living person, but absolutely, symbolically, I think it serves both purposes in theory.
Yeah. And so today, we have a modern federal system, a society that, is structured around, we have the U.S. Prosecutor's Office, the U.S. Attorney, which you were one of, and we have the federal defenders, and we have these charges that are brought. And I'm just wondering, what does the pardon power really do today? Like, why do we need to have a pardon power? What's going on in the system that, is it mandatory minimum? Like, why do we need to have it? Why aren't there other release mechanisms in place right now?
Well, in the federal system, there's no parole, right? There hasn't been parole since the 1980s. And there's two ways of appealing a criminal conviction. There's the direct appeal, where you get the conviction, and then you go to the higher court, and then you go to the Supreme Court if it's a state law conviction. If there's a constitutional issue, you go all the way to the United States Supreme Court. There's also something called habeas corpus, which is an old doctrine, which is basically a civil action, a separate action, suing the government because you have the body. That's the habeas corpus in Latin. It's incredibly complicated. The Supreme Court's made it harder and harder to get relief from wrongful conviction. We say based on, police misconduct, based on, witnesses that had some incentive to lie, based on information, evidence that is not reliable anymore, right? The Supreme Court in a case called Herrera versus Collins said, in the habeas context, even if you've got evidence exonerating you, if you've got new evidence showing you are innocent, you cannot use habeas to get out of prison unless you can separately show some violation of your constitutional rights. And the rationale was that there's always the pardon. So we know in this moment, the Supreme Court's acknowledged in this moment, that we are incarcerating, depriving people of liberty, your ability to move out, that's due process, life, liberty, and property. We are even executing people, depriving them of life, knowing that they are innocent or they could possibly be innocent. And there's no mechanism in the federal system to address that extraordinary injustice, besides, in theory, the pardon power. But as I argue in the book, George W. Bush, I don't think this is in the book, but George W. Bush, on his way out of office, bemoaned how at the end of a term, there's this flurry of requests for pardons. And there's pressure to pardon people with money, with access, lobbyists, right? Who are gonna write a big check to your presidential library. Bill Clinton famously pardoned this guy named Mark Rich, a financier that fled to Switzerland, horrible tax crimes, other crimes. He pardoned him. Congress opened investigation, the Department of Justice, Southern District of New York opened investigation. He wrote an op-ed, Clinton, saying he regretted it, but he gave a lot of money to Clinton interests. So the question is, sure, there's this opportunity to use the pardon to correct these injustices, but it's not happening. Ever since Bush, I think with the exception of a Biden and Obama, including Clinton, every president has run in part for office, you just saw it yesterday, on being tough on criminals, tough on crime. Meanwhile, $80 billion, with a B, of taxpayer dollars goes to incarcerating people. $80 billion. And we're not having a conversation about how to capture that misuse of taxpayer dollars, not only a waste, but also depriving people of core constitutional protections and what are in other countries human rights violations. I mean, we're also one of the only countries in the world that execute people, let alone a liberal democracy that executes people. So if we're going to have a pardon power, I mean, if it was Kamala Harris, I've made this argument publicly. George Bush said too, presidents should come in and announce their pardon policy to not attract all this abuse and corruption. I would have advocated for Kamala Harris and maybe, Biden in his last days of office to use it for how it's intended. Because I suppose in theory, the beauty of it is you can bypass Congress. You can bypass prosecutors, juries that are biased. You can bypass the political system, the problems with money in the criminal justice system. If you've got money for a good lawyer, your rights go through the roof, right? If you don't have money to pay bail, you will serve your entire sentence without a single piece of evidence being put against you. So much for innocent until proven guilty. Innocent until proven guilty if you have the money to make bail and to pay for a good lawyer. A good criminal defense lawyer with enough money will impanel a mock jury, mock witnesses, mock judges, mock prosecutors to go through your entire trial. That is certainly, you're in a much better posture than someone who is relying on a criminal defense lawyer that's paid by the government that, by the way, doesn't attach the second you get arrested. And in some states, you're just not going to get a decent defense, not because they're bad lawyers, but because they're overworked. So there's a role for the pardon power, but it's become corrupted. 6 members of Congress. I went to lunch with the chief prosecutor recently to confirm this of the January 6th congressional investigations. 6 members of Congress asked for pardons after January 6th. Rudy Giuliani was peddling them for $2 million a pop, allegedly, according to a civil lawsuit. Jared Kushner, who has no official role, he was not on the federal payroll, was the report, he denies this, but was reportedly the pardons are under Donald Trump, and his father got a pardon. Chris Christie, former New Jersey governor, he was also U.S. attorney for New Jersey, said it was the most egregious, disgusting crime he ever prosecuted was Jared Kushner's dad. So if we're in this moment where, the people that in theory should be caught by the check of the pardon power, right? Those who don't have agency are not getting it because they don't have the access. And the rich and the powerful who have plenty of access to justice already are the ones that are getting it. It's broken. And I'll just use an example from the book too, this idea behind what does it mean to have a mercy pardon. In England, okay, there were no jury trials, I think, until the 13th century. There was no established criminal justice system. There were no 4th, 5th, 6th amendments to the Constitution. There weren't appeals, right? And there were a lot of death penalty sentences for low-level crimes. So there's a story in the book, a little girl, she's 4 years old. She opened a door, and there was a child on the other side, and there was apparently some kind of pot of water. The kid got knocked into the water, and the kid drowned. And this little girl, would have had some severe sentence by virtue of the fact there were no checks and balances. The dad had to go to the king pardoned the child out of mercy. So you can argue that at that time, maybe there was a need for this because it was the Wild West, for lack of a better word. We have deep problems in our criminal justice system here. I just argue in the book the pardon power isn't, at least at the federal level, fixing them.
Yeah, and in fact, you sort of write, in talking about this system of checks and balances and how they work within our three branches of government, you write, the pardon power is discretionary, unpredictable, lacking in procedures and transparency, and its exercise is not subject to review or oversight. The president is utterly unaccountable. Think she has an opinion about this?
I'm not shy about this.
What do you think, sort of broadly speaking then, about this pardon power and the fact that the president really is unaccountable? Is that true? First of all, is there really no check on the president's ability to use a pardon as he or she, but as he sees fit?
Okay, well, two answers to that. The reason this even came up is because 8 years ago, I guess maybe not 8.5 years ago, I was never planning in my career to do any public-facing TV, radio, any of this, writing these books. But I was reading the New York Times, and there was this, right when Trump took office, there was a statement in an article that said the pardon power is absolute. And I was like, that can't be right. If a president pardoned only people based on their race, that would be a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, right? Every part of the Constitution is checked. We learned this in law school, right? No more kings. You take the king, where the power came from God, like a triangle, you flip the triangle, the power's in the people, it trickles down, right? So this can't be right. There's checks. It's not a king, it's a three-headed monster. It's a monster right now, but, and so I wrote my first op-ed, and that then, circling back today, to your question, we over the summer had this decision by the United States Supreme Court that the president is above the law, can commit crimes with impunity. And in that decision, the court said pardon power is core, no oversight. I was listening to the oral argument, and I was shocked when this came up in oral argument because of my little op-ed for the Baltimore Sun that spawned this whole sideline career, because people read the op-ed and the radio would listen, whatever. When the justices pushed counsel for Jack Smith on whether pardons were absolute, he said yes. He said they're absolute. I was like, what? You're a good lawyer. You're supposed to caveat like crazy. So I think, the answer to a lot of questions about whether something is constitutional is, can they get away with it? The question isn't so much, are there checks, but does anyone enforce the checks? If no one enforces the checks, they can get away with it, right? That being said, the mythology of the pardon power being absolute is wrong. There aren't that many cases around the pardon power, but there are some that limit it. For example, the Supreme Court has held that if you want to claim your privilege against self-incrimination and not have to testify, the president can't pardon you and take that Fifth Amendment privilege away and force you to testify. you don't have to accept a pardon. The Supreme Court has said if one of your criminal penalties is to pay money, like you can be, incarcerated. You can't incarcerate corporations, so they only pay money, right? So if a president pardons you, you can't get your money back because that's infringes on Congress's power of the purse. So I argue there could be constraints on the pardon power if those questions got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, not this court, used this idea of checks and balances. There just haven't been many of them up there. So I would have to answer, if you take that history of not a lot of case law around it, and you add to it the immunity decision, the pardon's absolute. I got a call today from an AP reporter wanting to ask this based on yesterday's results. He asked me that very question. What happens if Donald Trump pardons all the January 6th insurrectionists? Are there any limits on it? Is there a process he has to follow? No. He could do it on the back of a napkin. Then the question would be, I think, who's covered by it. So I think it's important to, and John Dean talks about it when he drafted the Jimmy Hoffa pardon, you have to lawyer it, because some people will say they're covered, but no, there's no limits on it.
Yeah, it's an astonishing thing. He really can pardon whoever he wants. And to your point now, he's emboldened because the court has insulated himself, Donald Trump or any president.
Right, that's why I say the pardon power is really important,
Yeah.
because the court manufactured immunity, really literally amended the Constitution. And yeah, I'm not shy about these things, but I could talk for 2 hours as to why I'm right. Sorry. I'm not just, it's not hyperbole, I can justify it. But so the court basically said, okay, if you use your official power, you're totally immune. If you use your unofficial or private power, there might be some criminal liability. So imagine you want to assassinate a political rival, which is, I think, Justice Sotomayor raised this, or one of them did. You want to assassinate a political rival, not for the interest of the country, for terrorism, because you want them dead, because you don't want them to run against you for president. Kind of like what happened, at least with the first impeachment in Zelensky, and that's a whole thing. Donald Trump basically asked the president of Ukraine to announce an investigation into a political rival to kill Joe Biden's chances for president. That's the whole first impeachment. But in theory, imagine you went further and said, I just want him dead, okay? If the president were to go to his childhood musket, in his weekend ranch with his parents, and pull it out of the closet with his dog-eared teddy bear and shoot the person with his private pistol, maybe that would be okay, right? Meaning the criminal justice system could litigate that. If you direct SEAL Team 6 to do it, now the president is totally covered. Because you're using official power, number one. Number two, the Supreme Court said you can't look into motive. So whether he's doing it to protect the country or just to make himself, a king for life is irrelevant. You can't look into it. The Supreme Court said that. And you can't even look into the evidence around that decision. So that all of that is now insulated. So, but how would you get SEAL Team 6 to do it? They're not covered by the pardon power. Right now, military people take an oath to the Constitution, aside from the lowest level, enlisted people. They could say, I won't do it, I'm not going to do that. They would face retribution if you had that kind of menacing president willing to do it. But then the president could also say, don't worry, I'll just pardon you. So you take immunity and you add the pardon power, then you've got a criminal conspiracy in the White House with no accountability whatsoever. So the pardon power is now front and center. It's front and center in lots of things, right? It's mercy versus corruption. It's unlimited king, no more kings versus democracy. It's like this. It's the center of the spoke of so many wheels. People think it's boring, but I agree with you. It's not.
Far from boring. And one of the things also, maybe like less dramatic than the idea of the president ordering someone else to kill someone or taking his dog-eared, teddy bear with him when he does a shooting with his musket, is the idea of paying for bribes or paying for pardons. The Supreme Court said the same thing that you were just saying. You can't look at evidence around those conversations because that's all protected now, right?
Yeah, well, and some have said, that would still, Bill Barr, who was Attorney General at the end of Donald Trump's last presidency, said, oh yeah, you couldn't do pardons for bribes, right? But as you indicate, I mean, a criminal case, like any case for the non-lawyers, like if you want to prove negligence or you want to prove murder, it's like a cookbook. It's like ingredients in a recipe, right? If you don't put the sugar in your cookies, they're not going to work, or you're not going to put the leavening. So bribery, you have to have evidence of the official act in exchange. Now that's off the table, right? You can't put that in the recipe book. And it's not against the law to take a bunch of money. I mean, if somebody wants to give me $2 million, like, you might have to pay taxes on it, but it's not illegal. And there's a lot of problems with that. Do we want pardons for bribes? No, but also, it's really clear in the impeachment clause of the Constitution that bribery is impeachable. The impeachment clause also says that notwithstanding impeachment, you can be convicted of a crime. So the Supreme Court really wrote that whole part out. I mean, these are supposed to be textualists that read the plain language. It says in the Constitution that someone's impeached, presumably for official power, abuse of official power, because you and I can't be impeached. We're not president. It's not just private power. Official power, you can be indicted and convicted of a crime. That says it in Article 2 of the Constitution. Our friends on the majority of the Supreme Court, the so-called textualists, got out the Sharpie, crossed it out, and created immunity. I mean, this is why, as we're getting off topic, I think the Supreme Court is really a problem right now. And it's one that we can't fix at the ballot box. Yeah.
So let's talk about President Trump's first term in office and how he used the pardon power then, maybe as a precursor for what we might expect to see in 4 years from now. So how did he use his pardon power? I know his first pardon grant was Sheriff Joseph, I always say his name.
I think it's Arpaio, yeah.
From Arizona. Can you tell us, that was the first pardon ever used for a contempt of court case,
Yeah, so he's
right?
racially profiling people, and he was prosecuted, and there was a court order, and he pardoned him for that. And that was stunning because that is a real snub of the judge and the whole judicial system. So that was the first one. And he's not the first to use pardons, in a shady way. George H.W. Bush pardoned people, including Caspar Weinberger, former Secretary of Defense in the Iran-Contra, and he was going to be investigated himself, George H.W. Bush, by all accounts, and that shut down that whole investigation. So it's not just Donald Trump, but I think famously, he pardoned folks in connection with the Mueller investigation. Right, Roger Stone, he pardoned Paul Manafort, and he dangled on, then it was Twitter, praise for not turning, not flipping. So there is definitely a record of using the pardon power to obstruct justice, to shut down accountability. But in a way, I think the pardon power, by the book anyway, but I think it's kind of going to be obsolete moving forward because of that decision. There's nothing to pardon anymore. If a president commits crimes, they can never be prosecuted, so they won't have to worry about pardons.
Well, there's nothing to pardon. There's lots of folks who need
No,
pardons.
for presidents, for self-pardons,
Right,
for presidents.
self-pardons.
Other folks need it, and just also to be clear, you could still, you can't pardon, presidents can't pardon state crimes.
Right.
So I think one thing, if he does pardon all the January 6 folks, is does the District of Columbia come in and go back behind him and prosecute these folks for local crimes?
Right, we've been talking exclusively about federal clemency, and if we have time, we can go into sort of some of the differences or similarities at the state level. But before we do that, I do want to just stay a little bit more with Donald Trump's use of, or abuse of power, however you want to sort of describe it. He seemed really persuaded, not just by the ways to insulate himself from liability or criminal accountability, but also by celebrity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there was a woman named Alice Johnson who was denied a pardon by Barack Obama. And she was caught up in a drug scheme. She had a very tough life, and I think she had a death in the family, and all the co-conspirators pled guilty. She had a very long sentence. And so Kim Kardashian found out about it, and she lobbied the Kushners and got her the pardon. And then Donald Trump brought her out in political rallies. You know, at the University of Baltimore, we have a death, we have various clinics, a death penalty clinic, but also criminal justice clinic. And there was a woman who had been trafficked as a child that was prosecuted for tax crimes. And our students in the clinic at the law school did secure a pardon through Donald Trump for her. So it's not to say, I mean, there's so many pardons. It's not to say it unilaterally, uniformly is for corruption, but it was like a pardon palooza in that regard with the last administration.
And you know, one of the things you mentioned, and then I want to get to sort of what are your suggestions about what can be done, what could be done. But before we do that, I'm just sort of curious about the processes, right? Because most presidents, at least theoretically, have these very convoluted processes that they follow. There's seven levels each application sort of has to get through before it hits the president's desk for consideration. And Donald Trump didn't use that process almost at all. I mean, I think a very small fraction of the limited pardons he gave came through that somewhat complex process, right? What do you think about the process that exists right now to get a pardon?
Well, there's within the Department of Justice, there's the Office of Pardon Attorney, and you have to submit an application. And you're actually not eligible through that process unless there's 5 years have passed since you've served your sentence. And the criteria don't include exonerating evidence. It's primarily around, you know, acceptance of responsibility and remorse and things like that. And the weird part about that, I think, is that you're asking prosecutors to recommend to undo the work of their colleagues who are prosecutors at the Department of Justice. So, and I think there are requirements, and you might know better than me, but that you have to get recommendations from folks that were, you know, involved in the process, judges and prosecutors that are involved in the process of convicting you. And so it's very, very difficult. But because the pardon power is what it is in Article 2, it's optional. The president can bypass that. In the early days, when there weren't that many federal crimes, the president read every application. The Attorney General, actually, in the early 20th century, would write an explanation for a pardon decision. Right now, it's optional if the president wants to do it. And even if you want to know why you were denied a pardon and you want to get those records, the Justice Department has used the exemptions from the Freedom of Information Act, saying this is the president's deliberative privilege and it's secret. So you won't, these days, you're denied, you don't even know why, you don't know why someone else knows why, and there's not the kind of public scrutiny. So I think there's a number of problems with that process, and very few, as you say, applications get to the president's desk. I think when Trump took office, there were like 11,000 or something. Biden's used it very sparingly. I mean, he hasn't really used it. So we'll see if in his last days in office he does. And the big issue is, of course, his son, Hunter Biden.
And so, what?
Can I say one other thing about this? This is really interesting to me. I did a talk last weekend in Austin on this book, and there was a teacher in the audience who, the other thing, Trump pardoned hip hop artists, a number of well-known hip hop. So there's a teacher who has his students, lower income, maybe, you know, get some, his particular demographic of students get involved sometimes in criminal activity. He said he's having a really hard time, given those pardons, explaining this is not a green light to commit crimes. And his students think, I'll just get a pardon because, you know, Kodak Black got a pardon. So I'm, you know, it's okay for me to commit crimes. I thought that was a really interesting byproduct. Of course, it's anecdotal of Donald Trump's pardons, that it's getting people in more trouble, not less trouble.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have this constitutional right to pardon that's given to the president. What do you think, given some of the real problems that there are, the potential for abuse with it, what do you think we can do to assist with some of these potential abuses? Is there anything we can do to prevent them or to regulate them, or are we just stuck?
Well, I always answer this question with like education, education, education. I mean, most people who hear about this book or listen to one of my, podcasts or what, they're like, I had no idea anything about the pardon power. This is so, I had no idea this was there. So number one is education. You'd have to amend the Constitution, I think, to really constrain the president's power, which is, we've done it 27 times, and we can have a conversation what I would do if I could amend the Constitution. There's a constitutional amendment pending, actually, that was introduced this summer to undo the immunity decision or put the Constitution back where it was in May, and would ban self-pardons as well. But beyond that, it's like lots of things, friends. You gotta go to Congress. There's so much that Congress can do and doesn't do. And really what I argue the best, maybe it would help, is transparency. Is amending the Freedom of Information Act so that you could get the records of pardons, and then there would be public scrutiny and the press would be interested in it. I also talk about the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which you can't ban lobbying because it's the First Amendment. But there are, again, disclosure requirements, and it's very, very rarely enforced. So there's all kinds of lobbying that goes on in Washington that is off the books because the U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't do anything about it. But I read the statute, and it does actually apply to the president. So one thing would be to amend the Lobbying Disclosure Act to expressly include pardons. Again, if you get the press interested in stuff, friends in the press and in the audience, that can get some eyes on it and some political accountability. The other thing that I suggest, Congress can create agencies. The only agency that's in the Constitution is Treasury. So all the other, Department of Justice, Department of Commerce, Department of Labor, they're all manufactured by Congress. Congress could create a pardon agency, and like other parts of the country and other parts of the world, put a bunch of people on there that have interest in this, criminal justice advocates, maybe formerly incarcerated people, mental health experts, educators, former prosecutors, family members, victims' rights, whatever, and have have the recommendation come from a body like that and not through prosecutors undoing the work of prosecutors.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously right now that might be a really tough sell with the current makeup of our Congress.
That's not going to be on the agenda.
Yeah,
No.
not right now.
No, that's not the first 100 days, no.
Or, yeah, we'll see. So I think we have about 10 minutes left or so, is that right? So why don't we take some questions from the audience for Kim about her wonderful book, or about pardons in general, or about the book series that this is the fourth in, is that right?
It's the fourth.
So
Or anything. I mean, I know this is a heavy weighty day, and I don't mean to be such a downer about things. So we can also talk about what happened yesterday, and I've been chatting about this on air for a long time. So whatever people have on their minds, I want to make it a comfortable space.
Take your mic and bring it to the question.
Oh, good idea.
Yeah, I don't think I need the mic here.
Well, it helps with the recording.
Yeah, I just want to go back to what you were talking about in terms of the question you were asked about granting pardons to the January 6th people that were convicted. I didn't quite follow your complete answer there, but my understanding would be an amnesty, but he would have to define it. In other words, would it be just for people that committed felonies or just for misdemeanors? How do you
It's up to him. It could be, you could say anything relating to January 6th, and then the courts would have to sort out what that means. His team would have to figure out who within that context they would want to pardon. I mean, Richard Nixon was pardoned before there was any indictment. So in theory, the court could have construed the pardon power as requiring a conviction. But now we've got history that says there doesn't even need to be an indictment. So in theory, the pardon could go beyond just the 1,200 people that have been, or thereabouts, that have already been convicted. There aren't really restraints on the wording of the pardon. John Dean worked on Jimmy Hoffa's pardon and constrained his ability to participate in the Teamsters, and he then sued and got mad about that and said that was unfair that Nixon did that. And he ended up, I think, in a parking lot someplace, buried 6 feet under, but that's another story. But I want to make one point on the January 6th pardons. One of the first empirical studies of pardons ever done was done this summer. And it was about the pardons, and specifically, among other things, the January 6 pardons. There was widespread condemnation from both Republicans and Democrats. A majority of both did not want to see pardons of the January 6 insurrectionists. And they were asked why, and the reason was because they were concerned it would incentivize violence around elections. I think most of my friends in the or colleagues in the world of voting and elections really thought there'd be a lot more yesterday. That's, I think, that's a really good thing we could feel good about, that there wasn't violence yesterday. So in light of that, I don't know what the political calculation will be to rip that Band-Aid off and pardon those folks, but they're expecting it for sure. Yeah.
While we're waiting for more questions, I actually had a question, if I could borrow my.
Yeah.
So could you, while we're waiting for the next question, could you tell us about the pardon of Susan B. Anthony, which has nothing to do with Trump, but which was just, I was like, what happened here? So tell me, well, it does have something to do with Trump, tell us.
Yeah, well, so she was convicted of voting illegally when it was not, women couldn't
Susan
vote.
B. So what year are we talking about? In 19?
That is in the teens, I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah, it was a long time ago. And so he pardoned her, and there's two Susan B. Anthony organizations, one that's anti-abortion and one that's actually Susan B. Anthony-ish. So he pardoned her, and her legacy organization objected to it after the fact because they said she would not have wanted that. She deliberately violated the law to send a message for justice, for inequality for women in voting. And so that was, an interesting, you think Susan B. Anthony, isn't that a great thing that Donald Trump did that? But actually, her legacy defenders were offended by it.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Oh, over here first. Oh, sorry.
Forgive me if you answered this, but so Trump can pardon himself?
Again, the answer to that is what's to stop him, and if there's nothing to stop him, yes, he can.
And
I mean,
the process-
there's no answer either way in the law or in the Constitution, but I don't know what would stop him, right? I don't know who would push back on
So
that.
does a person apply for their own pardon, or does somebody else apply for their pardon? To make
it's
the
an
request?
it's an application, I'm not sure. I mean, you probably have a lawyer do it for you, you probably have to sign it.
Okay.
But if you're president, I don't think you need to. It's probably sitting in a drawer in Mar-a-Lago from the last presidency. I mean, there's case law that says that a pardon is an admission of guilt. So I personally think there is a pardon sitting around in Mar-a-Lago or wherever, because he dangled this when he was president. He said, I can pardon myself. But if he were to pull that out, he would have to admit it, which he couldn't do. Plus, he's got, besties on the Supreme Court, so he hasn't needed that. They killed all those investigations through all these, shenanigans. But I at the end of the day, I think if he were to pardon himself in January, which I don't think he'll do, I think he'll just shut it down in other ways. I don't know who would have standing to sue and get that before the court. There's probably no one who could actually bring a lawsuit. But even if they did, the Supreme Court, based on the immunity decision, would say it's constitutional.
Yeah, I had a question.
Oh, hi.
I was just curious, putting together two things you said. One, that there's no sort of check on the pardon power generally, and also that you don't need a conviction. Would it then, in theory, be possible for the president to pardon someone on a going forward basis?
That's a great question. So, I mean, I say there's no law either way. It's just the more historical precedent that people have just assumed means that you can pardon someone if they haven't been indicted. The court has said you cannot pardon someone for a crime that is yet to be committed. So, in my hypothetical about SEAL Team 6, they wouldn't be protected until they actually did the assassination. At least that's so there is that other limit on the pardon power. So is that your question? Could I say I'm president, yay, and I like all you, so I'm gonna just pardon you for any federal crimes for the rest of your lives? No, that wouldn't work, at least according to Supreme Court case law, which is one of the arguments I made. One of the reasons I wrote the book is because there's such widespread mythology. And when I wrote that first op-ed, I got pushback from other faculty in the academy across the country on X, like, what are you saying that there are limits on the pardon power? There's no limits on the pardon power. There's this mythology. Everybody almost gets offended that there's not king president when it comes to pardon power. But if you look at the case law, there are limitations, including that you can't pardon someone if the crime has yet to be committed. That's not in the Constitution. The Supreme Court has seen fit to put that restraint. So I argue there should be other restraints. There's also language in Supreme Court decisions saying flipping a coin for pardon could be a problem. So we could see more limits. To answer your question, litigants would have to figure out how to get those cases before the court, and we would have to have, a Supreme Court that's not really, thrilled about unlimited power in the presidency, that really wants to see the presidency checked in some way.
I just have one more.
Okay.
So everyone mentions that the pardons happen at the end of the term. And is that because of the sort of reputational damage that would occur if something happened during the term?
Yeah, I think
If
this
that's
is
the
why
case.
our Arpaio pardon was kind of a surprise, because, in the old days, there was political pushback for these kind of, no-nos. Not that long ago, there was concern about the press pushback. So people would leave them to the end where they were lame ducks and there wouldn't be that kind of political accountability. I mean, the press we haven't had time to talk about this, the press is a big piece of this. I was in the green once in the BBC years ago, and one of the folks was one of the first Republicans in the Congress to turn on Nixon and to go to the White House. And he resigned, and he said those days are over. This is probably at least 6 or 7 years ago, and things have even gotten crazier. He said because there was one set of facts that went to the American public through legacy media, through the Washington Post, through 60 Minutes. Everyone got that set of facts, and the public turned on him. And that's why we went to him and said, you gotta resign, you just don't have the support. Now we each get a different set of facts, and a lot of it are lies, in our phones. And they're fed to us through algorithms that are designed to mirror our biases. So anyway, that was just an interesting point. So I think for a lot of reasons, who cares if you pardon somebody now and it's politically, a problem? We just don't have that infrastructure or that sensibility in America anymore.
So there's no recidivism data on the pardon?
I don't know that. I don't know the answer to that. Actually, that's not true. One of his pardons, Donald Trump's pardons, did go on to commit a domestic violence offense over the summer. So I stand corrected. You're nodding. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you give us insight on what will happen? Is it 10 days from now when Judge Merchan, am I pronouncing that
Oh,
right?
yeah, Merchan, yeah.
Is scheduled to sentence
Donald Trump.
President-elect for, I hate to even say the word, President-elect,
34 felonies.
34 felonies in the Hush Money case. Any insights there? Or
I don't have any
forecasts
insights.
or forecasts?
Incarceration, I think, was unlikely anyway, because for a lot of reasons, the kind of crimes, as far as his record and that he's president, or he was president, the idea of incarceration, of course, is not going to happen under any level. So I think there'll be two options. One kind of, parole or not parole, probation, something low. Or postponing a sentence until after
And that
he
could-
finishes.
Whatever sentence is handed down could be appealed, am I correct or no?
Yeah, of course it could be appealed. And I think, maybe we're in a rosy, glowy part. I think any judge that would do that would have to really worry about their safety in this moment. So, and that's been a problem for prosecutors, for witnesses, for jurors, for judges, and people I know that know people within DOJ and FBI. The culture has changed since Donald Trump, just in terms of the appetite to do any kind of criminal accountability for people in power.
I think Alvin Bragg said publicly he felt threatened earlier in this process.
Well, I think they all have security details, and their families have been threatened, and so I don't know. I think it's going to be a nothing burger one way or the other. But Merchan is a serious judge, and will try to do something that doesn't seem like he's caving to politics. But there won't be any real accountability.
Thank you.
Anyway, thank you. Oh, you want
One
to?
last one.
So actually two, what, with respect to the pardon or any other legal action keeps you up most at night about what Donald Trump might do? And the second part is, can you just talk a little bit more about the amendment that's out there in the docket, what the process is, where that sits?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks for that question.
Nightmare.
Well, I mean, I talk a lot about not just the pardon, but Constitution. So I started this a long time ago, as I explained. What worries me the most is what will happen to our ability to speak if we feel that there's going to be retribution for criticizing the government. Will we feel comfortable being here? Will I feel comfortable saying these things? I mean, I assume I'm on a list somewhere, I'm way down somewhere, but I mean, it's not, you know, if we read Project 2025, right? I mean, that's what I worry about. Will we not want to post stuff on Instagram? We'll be careful who our friends are. And I think that's real to me because of what's been promised. So it's how we get between now and then. There are various ways with retribution and using the Department of Justice as a political arm, which he's been very, very clear he's going to do, and he tried to do it in the last administration, and there were folks in there that stopped him. So I think it's fair to assume that'll happen. So that is what keeps me up at night. Because I think if you can't speak and you can't associate freely, you start checking what you think. And when you start checking what you think based on what the government will do, I think we lose something about our humanity and our identity and our soul. So that's my biggest concern. As far as the amendment, has probably gone nowhere, sorry. It was proposed. So, but this sounds a little bit Pollyannish or maybe too optimistic, but I think people could come together and do something like that. It does take supermajorities in both houses of Congress, so you'd have to take back the Congress. It takes supermajorities in every state legislature across the country. But if you think about the inverted triangle, right? That it's we the people, right? And the power gets trickled down to our elected leaders. We really are the government. People get mad at the government, but in theory, we are the government. It's us. It's all of us. And if our vote was so irrelevant, it wouldn't be so coveted, and there wouldn't be so many things in place to try to make it hard to vote. And I could talk an hour about how the Supreme Court has chipped away at that. And that would be my number one constitutional amendment, to have an affirmative right to vote in the Constitution. It's not in there. And because it's not in there, baloney sausage, as our grandpa would say, bogus excuses to restrain the right to vote fly through the courts, because there's nothing on the other side to stop them. There's no affirmative right to vote. If there was a right to vote, like there's right to bear arms, it would just be harder. So I think, as dark as we feel and as sad as we feel, sometimes you gotta go through the darkness to come out in the light. And I think, we think about after 9/11, if we were, there are no young people here. I'm usually, increasingly, I have these children in my law school classes that don't remember they were babies. It was a galvanizing force. We found each other. And we found our commonality. It didn't happen with COVID because we were in our silos, but there's a possibility in this, this watershed moment right now. This is a defining moment in American history. So it's scary, but it's also, there's opportunity here that did not exist a day or two ago for us to come together in a way. We didn't find a reason. We didn't think there was a reason to do it. But I speak in Washington, there are a lot of people, I live in DC, and there are people from all over the world. You get in an Uber or whatever, and you go to a school. People that grew up or lived in authoritarian regimes, they understand palpably what we're talking about. I did a speech in Norway, and the woman who was did the speech the year before was a Ukrainian reporter. 3 weeks later, she went back to Ukraine and was killed by a bomb. She was like 32 years old. People over there understand what they're fighting for. They understand. what we're talking about. Americans, this idea of American exceptionalism, we haven't had to have really test it in a very long time. So it's not like, oh, great, let's all have some tragedy so we see what matters. But that is where we are. And I believe we got some young people. I have so much faith in the next generation. If we empower them, they can do some really great things.
Thank you. I think that was a very hopeful ending, so thank you so much, both of you, to come and share all this with us and answer our questions and get us forward fighting for justice. So thank you everyone. We're going to pull up chairs here so we can sign books, and we have more books for sale on top. And I just want to thank everyone for supporting us throughout the year.